This reading is from 2 Kings. In the 5th month, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the bodyguard, a servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He burned the house of the Lord, the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every great house he burned down.
Hello, I'm Dan, and tonight's second reading is from Isaiah 65. It's one of my favorites. For I am about to create new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind. But be glad and rejoice forever in what I am creating. For I am about to create Jerusalem as a joy, and its people as a delight. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and delight in my people. No more shall the sound of weeping be heard in it, or the cry of distress. No more shall there be in it an infant that lives but a few days, or an old person who does not live out a lifetime. For one who dies at 100 years will be considered a youth, and one who falls short of 100 will be considered accursed. They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For like the days of a tree shall the days of my people be, and my chosen shall long enjoy the work of their hands. They shall not labor in vain, or bear children for calamity. For they shall be offspring blessed by the Lord, and their descendants as well. Before they call, I will answer. While they are yet speaking, I will hear. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox, but the serpent's its food shall be dust. They shall not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, says the Lord.
Reading from John 4. The woman said to him, Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem. Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and is now here, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeks such as these to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth.
Because we're thinking about beginnings, new beginnings, sort of in the new year. This is our focus, and not. We used the example a couple weeks ago, not like winning the lottery kinds of new beginnings, but like figuring out how to be broke and generous at the same time. And those are very different understandings of a new beginning. So not an externally imposed new beginning, but an internally cultivated new beginning. Not circumstantial, but formational. Not like the creation of the world, kind of a new beginning, where God breathes life into you without your consent, and you just become a person. You didn't have any say in it. But like the people who told the creation stories, we said this the first week, they're telling a new and different story than the same tired, violent, dysfunctional story of scarcity, and they replace it with a story of dignity and goodness and love and abundance and creative generativity. And so not like Moses showing up and saying, we're out of here. No more slavery, but instead like the 40 years that followed, where they learned to be people of hope and uncertainty, trust in the moment, surrender, journey, human dignity. That's sort of a recap of the first 2 weeks. Or like tonight, it's not the new heaven and the new earth that drop out of the sky, even though this is powerful imagery, and we see that in the poetry. But the real meat of the imagery is figuring out how to be new in the world that we already have, with the stuff we already have, with the people that we already have. And it's not that there's not a lotto ticket sort of new beginning. It's just that very rarely does that sort of a new beginning lead to whole and healthy and life-giving ways of being. Lotto ticket, new beginnings, have been the product of religion for far too long. And I think it's high time that somebody say, no. It's not that simple. It's not that easy. It's not that fun. It's not just leaving Egypt. It's wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Someone has to say, and if nobody else is going to do it, we're happy to do it. This is going to suck. This is going to suck, right? Welcome. I'm glad you came. I'm glad you're giving your money. This is going to be horribly difficult. It's going to hurt. You're going to fail. But a chosen form of life and the group of people that we get to share that form of life with, that new way of being, for all the work, for all the journey and the difficulty, it's good. It's really good. It's a better way. It's more full. It's more loving. It's unconditional. It's an integrated life that we're sort of holding in front of ourselves and trying to go for. We think, I don't know, we could be wrong, right? But this is the best we've got, and that's what we're trying to do. So we're playing with this framework. This is sort of like loosely we're playing with this framework. This is like our sandbox. Text, context, question, and practice. And so I just want to run through these real quick, and then we'll flesh it out more. The text is Isaiah 65, new heavens, new earth. It's important to note this is not binary, right? And so new heavens and new earth is not a way of saying that there is a here and a there. It's not heaven somewhere else in a supernatural sense. This is actually a very Jewish way of saying everything. It's a reference to holism, saying a new sort of reboot of all things, new everything, whole new world here. That's what's meant by a new heavens and a new earth. Context, temple destruction, exile, temple rebuilding. We'll get more into that. But the context essentially has to do with real estate. I'm sorry for hurricane people. And the context is essentially about a location and about a building. It's about a sacred place and a sacred object. Jerusalem, the temple. And so the question is, where is God, right? This is maybe the question of the entire Bible and like religion and everything. But the reason it's the question in this text and in the context of this reading tonight is because we thought God was with this particular real estate, right? We thought God was with our temple. But the temple's not there anymore, right? It's been razed to the ground, and we thought God was in this particular place. But we're not there anymore. We've been hauled off to Babylon. So where is God? How do we understand this? And then the practice, rebuilding versus re-being. Again, are we talking about real estate, or are we talking about a form of life? Is it about getting back, and this may sound far too much like some people's understanding of America, is it about getting back to a golden age, or is it about the risk of going forward into an unimagined, entirely unknown future? So, I don't know, but I'm going to preach about it anyway. Isaiah has 3 sections, right? Isaiah is broken up into warning, judgment, restoration. It's not one author, it's multiple authors. But the restoration section is where we get the text from tonight, Isaiah 65. But first, the context of warning and judgment, to make a little sense of it. Warning, act right or else, right? That's the first 20 chapters. Like essentially God saying, you better not, but then they do. So judgment. In the 5th month, Nebuzaradan, this is prior to his cameo as a villain in the Power Rangers, the captain of the bodyguard, servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He burned the house of the Lord, the king's house, all the houses of Jerusalem. Every great house he burned down. So the temple is destroyed. A large number are taken into exile in Babylon, which I don't know why it's that way, to the left. Until Cyrus comes and conquers Babylon in 539, he subsumes the empire under his rule, permits the Jews who want to return to the land and rebuild the temple. Interesting note, David Malinowski pointed this out. David, you're watching, shout out. Not everyone wanted to leave Babylon, now Persia, to go back to Jerusalem, especially the ones who should have cared the most about the temple. The prophet Ezra says, I found that not one Levite had volunteered to come along, which doesn't seem like that big a deal until you realize that the Levites were the priests. So he says, you can go back and build the temple, and the priests are like, we're good. But, nope, we're fine, thank you. They had it better in Babylon than they did in Jerusalem. This was like the pinnacle of civilization. These were highly advanced cities. They had libraries. They had running water. They were allowed to openly worship if they wanted to under the Persian emperor. They were fully included civilly. They participated in the culture. And so the elites basically didn't want to go back. And what we know now is that there was very likely a slim minority of the Jews who were there that were actually even practicing in exile. Their fidelity had sort of shifted to comfort in Babylon, Persia, but they get permission to go back, right? Cyrus comes and says, you can go back if you want to. So last week we talked about the Exodus story. And a central theme in this middle chunk of Isaiah, right, the judgment section and where they get to go back, is that of a new Exodus. So the return of the exiled people from Babylon to Jerusalem is sort of envisioned by Isaiah as a new Exodus. And the author imagines this in a very ritualistic sort of return, repeatedly linking this to Israel's exodus from Egypt. But each of the elements is actually contrasted. The original Exodus participants left in great haste. That was one of the readings we read last week. Whereas Isaiah says in the new Exodus, they will not go out in great haste. The land between Egypt and Canaan of the first Exodus was a great and terrible wilderness, an arid wasteland. But Isaiah says about the new Exodus, the land between Babylon and the promised land will be transformed into a paradise, where the mountains will be lowered, the valleys will be raised up, it will create a level road, basically saying it's going to be easy for us to go home. In the first Exodus, water was scarce. In the new Exodus, Isaiah says, God will make a wilderness. In the wilderness, a pool of water. The dry lands will turn into springs of water. I want to make sure you catch this. This new beginning is new. This new Exodus is new, not because it replicates the old in exactly the same way. It's actually understood to be new because of its differences. It's not just redoing the same thing. It actually does things in an opposite fashion. And so Isaiah here is an innovator, even within his own tradition. In these really subtle but clear nods to the Exodus story, he's naming where they come from, but he's charting a new and very different course. He's inaugurating this new beginning that isn't just back to the same old thing. So he's saying this is like that Exodus, but part of what makes it new is that it's actually really different. And it's actually sort of playing on the idea that the possibility of a new beginning where you can go back to the same old thing, where the next dog can be just like the last dog, it's sort of pointing out that's a deception, right? We don't get that sort of a new beginning. We'll jump on that a little more in a second. So you've got warning, judgment, and then you get restoration. So this is the third section of Isaiah. And we find the passage from tonight in this text. This is composed, this section, just after the people returned from exile. And so it's while they're rebuilding the temple. Temple rebuilding is underway. We said the new beginning, the new Exodus, isn't getting the people out of Egypt, but getting Egypt out of the people. We said that last week. That's sort of the Exodus story. That's the kind of new beginning. It's not just that they walk out of an empire, it's how they get deprogrammed from having been slaves their entire lives. Similarly with the new Exodus, they get back, but realize they can never go back, right? They get back to the land, they get back to Jerusalem, they get back and everything's wrecked. And so they're back, but they sort of realize they can never go back. The Persians had ended the exile. Some of them had returned to Jerusalem, they'd rebuilt the temple, but it wasn't back to normal. They had major problems. They returned and found themselves in conflict with the people who had stayed in the country, who now owned the land, right? So they left and other people took over the land. And there were further conflicts over how they were going to set up this new form of government. They sort of bring their understanding of their tribe back from Babylon. There are other people who are there who are like, hey, no, that doesn't necessarily work for us, thank you. In addition, this is what I love. Even though the temple was installed precisely in the same place as the original temple that had been torn down, Ezra says, many of the priests and Levites and heads of the families, old people who had seen the first house on its foundations, wept with a loud voice when they saw this house, though many shouted aloud for joy. And then the prophet Haggai says flat out, the restored temple is simply less grand than the former temple. They can't redo it. They can't get it as good as it was back then. There is no such thing as back to normal, but maybe there's a new normal. Maybe. Okay, so text, context, question. Where is God? Is God in the land? Which land? Is God only in Jerusalem, or does God follow them to Babylon? And they ask for God to deliver them from exile, and God says, nah, bloom where you're planted, right? Figure out how to live in exile. Where is God? Is God in the temple? Which temple? Is God in the old temple in the same way that God is in the new temple? Is God in the Exodus? Which Exodus? Is God in the Exodus the old way, or is God in the Exodus the new way? Because they're apparently very different. They're both the Exodus, or an old and a new. Is God in search of a building, Or is God in search of a body, of a group of people, a community who embodies a certain way of being? Is this really about a place? Is it about a place where they can worship, or is it about a way of being? Is it about a kind of life? I think these questions drove Isaiah 65, and I think the response is one of the most radical new beginnings in the entire Bible, but it's really subtle. We don't see this actually fully realized until we get to Jesus and Paul, and they make it explicit, which is where we'll end. But what does this vision of a new beginning call for in terms of practice? This is the question. What does this imagine as sort of a new way of being? And I'm going to, kind of like I did last week, I'm just going to riff through this. I don't think it all ties together. Take what you like, leave the rest. I think the overarching practice is a communal living temple. I think this is sort of the understanding of what's envisioned in the Isaiah 65 passage. Like I said, it's not till Jesus and Paul that we see this more explicitly. Jesus says things like, the kingdom of God is within you. The kingdom of God is within you. Paul says things like, don't you know that you all are a temple of the Spirit? So there's some sense in which what's being said is God dwells in your community, not in your buildings. And maybe even that God dwells in your community, not necessarily in that land. But this stuff is all here in Isaiah. And it's this radical challenge to everything going on in the story from right within the story itself. Right? Because the overarching surface story is, it's all about the land and the temple. That gets wrecked. Everybody's depressed. They get deported. And all they can think about is getting back so that they can rebuild the temple and get back to the land. And right in the middle of that, we have this text from Isaiah where he's going, hey, what if it's not about the temple? What if it's not all about the land? What if it's about the way people live? But I want to start first with a practice that's related to the exile and to these sacred objects. Even though it comes before the passage we read tonight, I think it's important. It's the serenity prayer. I've talked about it before, but I think this creates a really healthy framework, and I'm just going to run a couple of these scenarios through it. So the serenity prayer is, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So God grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change, right? I'm in exile. What does it mean to learn to live in exile? Give me the courage to change the things that I can, so they get the opportunity. We can leave exile if we want to. And then the wisdom, right? I think the issue with the priests was not that they lacked the wisdom, it's that they lacked the courage. Let's check out another one. Give me the serenity to accept the things that I can't change. The temple's destroyed. You cannot change that. The courage to change the things you can. They can rebuild it. They can. They have that opportunity. Wisdom, should we? Right? Should we? If it's not making sense yet, Jurassic Park will help. This is one of my favorite scenes in any movie of all time. Ian Malcolm, who's a chaotician, if you're not familiar with the original Jurassic Park, they're talking about sort of the project of bringing dinosaurs back from prehistorians, making an amusement park, and people end up getting killed. And he says, I'll tell you the problem with the power you're using here. It didn't require any discipline to attain it. You read what others had done and you took the next step. You didn't earn the knowledge for yourselves, so you don't take any responsibility for it. You stood on the shoulders of geniuses to accomplish something as fast as you could, and before you even knew what you had, you'd packaged it and you'd patented it, and you slapped it on a plastic lunchbox and you're selling it. You want to sell it. And you were so preoccupied with whether or not you could, you didn't stop to ask if you should. For some reason, the story of the temple and the rebuilding of the temple for me I think of that. You were so busy, preoccupied with whether or not you could, you didn't stop to ask if you should. How many of you have ever done that? All the hands are up. Okay, so to be fair, not with dinosaurs, me either. But maybe with a relationship, or with a job, or maybe a big purchase, or a major decision, or it became convenient to sidestep what would otherwise have been your moral framework, where you got so preoccupied with whether or not you could do something, you didn't stop to think about whether or not you should. So what can't you change that needs to be accepted, right? This is that first part. Maybe the temple's destroyed. Maybe you're in exile. What's the situation? What is it that you can't change? And the work that needs to be done, the practice, is actually one of surrendering the outcome. right? And maybe you're driving yourself crazy trying to change something that you actually can't change. And the practice is to begin to recognize that and accept it and surrender that outcome, that is beyond your control. You can't change it. Where is the best practice for you now to surrender? And what can you change that requires courage? What needs your energy and passion in order to be transformed? There are things that you have some agency in that can be changed. And then finally, of course, just because you can change it, should you? Should you? And do you know the difference? You really know the difference between the things you can't change and the things you can. And it may be that the thing that requires courage is actually changing your desire to change things. That might be it for me for 2018. I think I might have peaked 3 weeks in. That was one of those things where I wrote it and I was like, oh no. Oh no. That's to me. I'm not listening. La, la, la. Create. So I'm just going to run through these because they're fun. So you look through this reading, and it's I'm about to create, I'm creating, I'm about to create, I'm creating. Apparently, God is doing a lot of creating in this passage. How? Through people. If you read on through the text, it's not like the original creation story where, God is saying, let there be light, and let there da-da-da, and God's like doing it. God is creating some sort of a new reality through people. If you look at the text, make money. Make a functional economy, make houses, plant things that take time, and then harvest them. Follow through, make community, care for your neighborhood, tend to the needy, make peace. We said the first week, new beginnings are not ex nihilo. There's no such thing as a new beginning out of nothing. God creates through people. People create through what they already have. This is not a whole new world, a whole different world. It's the same stuff. It's the same people. It's the same rocks and trees and bricks. It's not supernatural, right? The thing that's crazy here is that it's not supernatural. The new heavens and the new earth, they're built out of human technology. People building houses, people planting vineyards, people making community, people trying to create a functional economy, but it's a whole new world because it's a whole new way of being. It's not the heaven drops out of the sky new world. It's not the lottery ticket we didn't see coming new world. It's choosing a different way of being. So create. Remember. We said during the Exodus story, that's sort of like the call sign of the Hebrew scriptures. Remember that I'm your God that brought you up out of Egypt. Remember. We were talking at my home group last week or the week before, in Alcoholics Anonymous, they talk about the 9th step promises. And one of the lines that I love the most, it says, we will not regret the past, nor wish to shut the door on it. And we talked a lot about the difficulty, but the value of memory. That sometimes remembering the hardest things are the things that keep us from repeating those things. And part of the power, I think, of this passage is that it's loaded with imagery and language, which mean that it's loaded by memory. And so if you just read from top to bottom in Isaiah 65, you've got create, Jerusalem, planting, harvesting, trees, labor, offspring, God is listening and responding, animals are getting along, the snake is the villain. This is all creation imagery. Right? This is like a recapitulation of the creation stories in Genesis 1 and 2, which require memory to understand that they're loaded. And the fact that it begins with the phrase, I'm creating a new heavens and a new earth, should be a pretty clear throwback. But you've got to have this sort of memory, the sacramental memory and traditional memory to get that that's what's happening. Because memory helps to make meaning. Memory can be highly valuable. It reminds us where we come from and why we're here and what it is that we're up to. And part of the practice of being a living communal temple is to remember together. It's rituals where we decide actually together what's worth remembering, and then we practice remembering that stuff together, because apparently people are forgetful. Which brings us to the next practice. Forget. That slayed in my mind. That was I got people laughing, they were falling out of their chairs, because I was just talking about remembering. And then tight. That was good work. If you didn't hear that in the online community, she said I didn't remember. So there's value to memory. But the other practice is to forget. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind. This is right after I'm creating a new heavens and a new earth. And what we have to keep in mind is all the recent history that had been a part of Judah's experience, the terror of this Babylonian invasion, destruction of the temple, Jerusalem, this forcible dislocation, the subjugation of the leaders, maybe even their understanding that it was their infidelity, their sinfulness that brought this on, the beginning of the passage is that will no longer be considered, right? All of that stuff, all that trauma, everything that hurts, that will not be considered. Judah had been under this threat from their very earliest cultural memories. Enslavement in Egypt, they've been living under the shadow of the Assyrians and the Babylonians, these empires according to these formative narratives. Judah, their experience had sort of been one on the brink of extinction for their entire story. And so Isaiah here sort of crosses this threshold, I would say, as a radical theologian, as a deconstructionist. Because not only does he take the Exodus story and he sort of flips it on its head and he offers a new Exodus that's very different from the first, but here, with one of the massive takeaways from the first Exodus still ringing in their ears, remember, I am the God who brought you out of Egypt. His new beginning story comes not with remember, but forget. Forget. And again, this isn't binary. It's not either or. You can't choose either to remember or to forget because it's a question of tension and paradox and wisdom. Because, of course, there are things we must remember. We just said there's value to memory. There's sacramental, communal value to memory. But at some point, memory can also cross into the realm of becoming toxic. And we can begin to live and behave from these toxic memories. Bill mentioned at Occupy this week, it's called trauma reenactment or repetition compulsion. And like it sounds, this is the compulsion to relive trauma that you've experienced. So there's this phenomenon in which a person repeats a traumatic event or these circumstances over and over. And think like Groundhog Day, but hell, right? Like the worst thing you've experienced, but you've got this sort of psychological phenomena whereby you can't stop continuing to sort of almost seek out to repeat this. Or to put yourself in a situation where the event is likely to happen again. So for example, if you continue to choose the same route to school past the same bully who's stolen your lunch money every day for the last 5 years, neither changing your route, nor seeking help from anyone, nor packing your lunch rather than carrying cash, you're just continuing in that same path. Or maybe just for example, like a small and militarily impotent tribe continuing to rebuild a temple on a tiny slice of highly economically valuable land as a controlling point in a trade route, particularly prone to being conquered by military superpowers, continually putting themselves in situations where that event is likely to happen again and again and again. That's the story of Israel. So sure, let's remember what needs remembering. Let's remember healthy and life-giving big picture stories about who we are and why we're here, and stories that remind us that part of our values are to challenge narratives of violence and greed and destruction with narratives of love and creativity and generosity, but also, what are the former things that you need to forget? What are some of those toxic memories that you're still living from, that you're still repeating? Because part of the practice of this full life, part of the practice of being a living communal temple, is not just remembering, but it's forgetting. It's letting go of those former things that continue to crop up and repeat themselves and lead you into dysfunction. What could you purge from your memory that might begin to set you free from that repetition compulsion? Another word for this is insanity, right? Doing the same thing and expecting different results, or trying to solve problems with the same kind of thinking that created them. What could you leave behind? What are the former things that need to be forgotten? And then lastly, take responsibility. Yes. Because I think that the big picture sort of sermon in this text for me is a question of whether it's about the land and the building or whether it's about a group of people who practice a way of being. Is it about real estate or is it about a kind of life? Because the first is a sacred object that pacifies us from responsibility, letting us off the hook, dislocating responsibility from ourselves, and placing it in an external thing. But the latter places responsibility in our material existence, our form of life, our way of being. Not even in our objective beliefs, right? But in the way we spend our money, the way we spend our time, the way we treat people in our relationships, and the way that we do our work. personal responsibility. I think Shelley was, or not Shelley, it was Marilyn that brought up at Occupy that even in the development of the canon of our sacred text, we see this being edited out. And I think she brought up the example of Enoch and how there's text after text in the book of Enoch, hundreds of them, that are all about people's responsibility for their direct connection to God. And they're all edited out of the sacred text because it's more convenient if we can get people to work through the right religion or the right temple or the right priest or the right mediator. In some sense, the rebuilding of the temple is also a rebuilding of a system of clergy, a system that's localized, a religious mediation system, an exclusive institutional system. And we see this over and over and over, not just in the Bible, we see this in culture. The more that we offload responsibility to a sacred person or a sacred place, the more binary and dualistic our lives inevitably become. The more we give away personal responsibility to a sacred object or a sacred place or a sacred person, the more things become binary. The easier it is to exclude, the easier it is to marginalize and to other. We divide ourselves. So we've got the saying, it takes a village. In the Christian tradition, they call this the priesthood of believers. I would say the priesthood of the community. But we were sharing at Occupy that we see this actually done much better than it is in the Christian tradition, in traditions like Islam and Baha'i and the Quakers, where responsibility is on the village to lead. And yet, I'm not saying I have this figured out. I've been ordained for 13 years. I'm in the 6th year of a process to be formally connected to the United Methodist Church as an elder, whatever that means. Last year I was commissioned, whatever that means. I have sacramental authority, whatever that means. I think that's code word for magic hands, which is code word for jazz hands. The point is, some of our responsibility, I think part of the reason people keep coming here and participating in this conversation is because we have the sense that part of our responsibility is to push and to challenge and to deconstruct and to call bullshit from within the system. There's an Italian philosopher called Bonaventure Durati. He's actually an anarchist, but who's counting? He says, the only church that illuminates is a burning church. He means this literally, right? Because he's an anarchist. But Peter Rollins picks up on this as an image of the refining fire of deconstruction and how valuable it can be in the life of religious institutions. And the point that I think it makes is you don't put your hope. It's not only you don't put your hope in this building. Like I think this is nice. It's nice to have soft chairs, but you don't put your hope in me or in Caitlin or in a group of leaders. You don't put your hope in collective. You don't put your hope in any sort of sacred object. Right? In the biblical tradition, this is the beginning of idolatry. Because here's the trick, though. It's not just the clergy or, I think it was David that was saying, even the community can become the sacred object. We can come to view these people and the hour and a half that we spend together, hour and 45. We're chasing 2. It's fine. Don't look at your watches. We can come to treat this even as the sacred object. These idols, onto which we're tempted to offload our responsibility for the way we live our lives. Try to come and sort of purchase meaning from an institution or a person or a building or whatever. Oh, I guess that wasn't the last one. Focus on people. This is the last one. And this is just a quick thought. This is something I noticed this afternoon that I didn't want to leave out. In a tradition preoccupied with Jerusalem and with the temple, the focus of this passage, even though Jerusalem is named a couple times, the focus of the passage is on the inhabitants, right? The people are spoken about as a precious treasure in this new reality. Not a sacred object, but sacred subjects, the hosts, the temple of the Spirit. It's understood that God is with them, with this group of people, and the only thing that's spoken about in terms of building is building houses. Build houses, live in them. And at some level, this sensibility is at the heart of the Eucharist, right? We have this passage where Jesus says crazy things like, destroy the temple and it'll come right back. I'll raise it up in 3 days. It's not about this mountain or that mountain, but it's about how you live. It's about what you value, right? That's sort of the heart of the idea of worship. What do we ascribe worth to? It's about how you live and what you value. It's not about being on the right mountain or in the right temple. Not about a temple at all. It's about what happens when the temple is destroyed. It's about whatever is left. It's about what's raised up and elevated to importance. It's about the life that remains when sacred objects fall apart. It's not about the right temple or the right mountain, about spirit and truth and a way of being. And I know what you're thinking. Yes, Batman Begins. So Bruce says, I'm going to show the people of Gotham their city doesn't belong to the criminals and the corrupt. And then Alfred says, in the Depression, your father nearly bankrupted Wayne Enterprises combating poverty. He believed that his example could inspire the wealthy of Gotham to save their city. Bruce says, did it? Lucius says, in a way, their murders shocked the wealthy and the powerful into action. I think this is one of the best lines of any movie. People need dramatic examples to shake them out of apathy, and I can't do that as Bruce Wayne. As a man, this is going to be the greatest Eucharist intro you've ever heard. Buckle up. As a man, I'm flesh and blood. I can be ignored, I can be destroyed, but as a symbol, I can be incorruptible, I can be everlasting. And if you're not, you should be thinking, wait a minute, Jesus. Right? As a man, I'm flesh and blood. But as the Christ, as the symbol, is Jesus saying at some level, take your sacred objects, take your sacred sites, take your sacred people, even me, and don't ever stop breaking them open, pouring them out, keep destroying them, keep deconstructing them. And in the process, you're going to find that the life isn't in the things. It's in the people that share the practice. It's in the symbol that points to the reality that is deeper than any sacred object. It's this table of the sacred life beyond buildings, this way of being beyond locations. This is the table that's set for us tonight. It may begin as flesh and blood, but it's a symbol that points to more. I think we all know, because of church history, it's not incorruptible, but it calls us to the kind of life that is. And the invitation is not to come find life here, but to come here and be reminded to learn how to find life everywhere else. Because this table is an altar in the world. It's set for us tonight, but it's open to all people. And that means that no one will ever be turned away. When you're ready, feel free to come and grab a piece of bread and dip it in the cup.